All right, as we filter back in, please take your seats. We are going to begin the next exciting topic. This one sounds like it's going to come straight out of Hollywood. Trees, insects, and chemical warfare. What plants' defense can tell us about pest control. And with that, Dr. Michele Lanan.
Yeah, I keep dropping my microphone. Cool. So, yeah, trees, insects, chemical warfare. Go back. So today, I thought I would attempt a talk on pesticides, basically the natural basis for pesticides and how plants have been using chemical defenses basically since the beginning of plants against herbivores, and more broadly, the context for those types of chemical-mediated interactions. Because we humans are real newcomers to this planet, but we're heavily dependent on plants and crops, and we have quickly picked up this idea that you can defend a plant against pests like insects using chemistry. And we also have quickly become really talented at chemistry. Still not as talented as the plants, which are true chemical geniuses, but pretty darn good. And that has enabled we humans to create an awful lot of things. But how do those things fit into this ongoing battle that's been happening forever between plants and insects? And what sorts of things can we learn so that we can be smarter about how we use chemicals? So that's where I'm going in this talk, but I'm actually going to start out not with chemistry, but with setting the stage. So I'm going to set the stage on why plants use chemicals other than what they need to build their bodies to begin with. And that takes me to the topic of species interactions, because plants don't live in a vacuum. In fact, nothing alive can live alone in a vacuum on this planet. All species are interacting all of the time with each other and co-evolving. So we can think of ecosystems, including the ones that we live in and that feed us and that make up our world, as webs of ever-increasing interactions. And insects and plants are right at the heart of this action. They're kind of the thriving, interlaced web that's holding together all of the ecosystems we rely on. So I have a background in animal behavior and ecology and insects. So I like this framework for thinking about species interactions. And maybe some of you have encountered this. I bet a lot of you haven't. But I find this extremely useful. So species interactions, which is just any interaction, can be categorized by the effects on both species. If we had a pair of species, so here is species A. I made a little cute bug. This is species A, and it can have an interaction with species B. And there's going to be an effect if it interacts. Now, that effect for species A could be positive. It could be a little bit positive. It could be neutral, maybe. It could be a little bit negative, or it could be really negative. And that's it. I've described the entire space of outcomes. There are no other outcomes. Okay, how about species B? Make a graph. What is the effect of this interaction with species A on species B? Could be great, really positive, a little bit positive, neutral, a little negative, or terrible. Okay, so now I have mapped out the full space of outcomes for this two-species interaction based on whether it's positive or negative or neutral. And how do we scientists measure the overall effect? This is a little bit funny, right? We could give them a survey and ask, or we could find something to rate. In general, ecologists measure the overall effect in terms of overall survival or number of offspring. So contribution to the next generation, that's fitness. And the effect on a whole species rather than individual A is the average of many interactions over time. Now, why do we think like that? Scientists like to think about the overall effect through time because we think about evolution. And if species A and species B are interacting repeatedly, they're going to be co-evolving, right? One has an effect on the other, and that's going to influence how many offspring it has or whether it survives to have offspring. That's going to affect which genes are contributed to the next generation and what the next generation of species B looks like. And through time, these little push-pulls are what shape species. And it doesn't have to, each interaction doesn't have to always be the same. You know, 30% of the time, species A and B might have a great time and get along, and it's net positive. But 70% of the time, it's negative for species B. And so we would need to average that across the entire population through time. Okay, so let's grid out our space. Okay, so I made a grid. The colors don't mean anything. I just added colors so it would look cool. So negative, 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 neutral, positive, negative, those are all the possibilities for an interaction. And we have names for different types of interactions that species can have, and you'll have encountered many of these. Some of them are a little more specialized, but in the negative category, there's antagonism and competition. And I'll just run through these. So antagonism and competition. No one is having fun in these interactions. We're all familiar with competition, and since you all think about plants, you think about competition all the time, especially when you're thinking about where to plant stuff or when you're thinking about weeds, stuff like that. So here in this Costa Rican rainforest, you see, look at these plants, right? They're all struggling to get up and get access to the light, and some plants are actually hanging on other plants, and their leaves are shaped to maximize solar gain. So there's heavy competition here for access to light. There's probably also competition for things like nutrients between the different plants. Okay, so antagonism. Antagonism is a funny one and one that we often sort of ignore in biology, but it happens. Antagonism is when two species fight and they hurt each other and no one wins. So my favorite example, these are the harvester ants, Pogona myrmex. And there's another species of ant, Dorian myrmex, which are small and black, and they like to nest at the edge of the big pogo nest. They make those big bare patches on the ground. And every time these big red harvester ants pass the little black ants just like jump on them and start biting them. And I have talked to many other ant biologists, and none of us have a clue as to why they're doing that, except that they're kind of being dicks. Like, that's antagonism. I'm sure there's a reason, but neither ant seems to be enjoying it. There's other types of antagonism, right? Two species could just cause problems for each other. And they don't need to even actually interact directly to cause problems for each other. They don't have to touch. Here's an example of antagonism between me and some tree ants in Australia. These podomyrma, so I was on a hike and I was looking for rare and really cool ants in tropical Australia, and I found this tree that these arboreal, really cool ants live in. Look at their like fat legs. That's a great ant. And I was excited, so I wanted to make sure I could find that tree again on my way back. So I tied a piece of flagging around it. And then I came back, and the ants were like, "This is our tree. Who the hell put this flagging here?" They were mad. And they were busy disassembling the flagging. You can see all the shredding going on there. And they put most of their afternoon into this task of trying to get rid of this hated orange flagging. So we just caused problems for each other there. I mean, it wasn't serious, but that's a minor antagonistic interaction. Okay, so let's keep running through our chart. The next category, and because it's a chart and both sides have all the possible outcomes. You'll see everything twice, right, except in the corners. So amensalism is neutral for one and negative for the other. It's actually really hard in ecology and biology to prove no effect. Like there could be a minor negative or positive effect that we're just not seeing. So it's almost impossible to truly prove that it's neutral. So we don't tend to study these very much, but we'll call it nearly neutral. We would call this amensalism, where there's a negative effect on one, but the other just kind of doesn't notice. So I tried to think of a good example, and this is one I found. So here, this is at Walgreens, and this is a gray bird grasshopper. We had a big outbreak of these, and a lady going in ahead of me stepped on this grasshopper, did not even notice, just went on in. So this was really negative for the grasshopper, and I'm not sure if there was any effect on the lady. She maybe karma, I don't know. So is this really an amensalism? Could there be negative effects? I don't know, but that's my closest amensalism for you. To really know, we would have to do a study where we looked at the sum total of all interactions between graybird grasshoppers and humans this year or through time. And humans actually do a lot of things that are beneficial for graybird grasshoppers, like planting all these delicious decorative plants all around town. They love that. So it might actually be positive for the grasshoppers, even if they get stepped on now and then. Okay, now the things in the corner of this chart are really much more important than in the middle. Let's talk about predation, parasitism, and herbivory. And this is where we're going to get to chemistry and chemical mediated interactions. So predation, everyone knows this one. This is a cool spider. It was using camouflage on this tree and nailed this moth. And I thought, okay, that's a great picture for predation, right? So one is benefiting in predation. The spider is getting a moderate plus. The moth is getting the ultimate minus, right? It's not much worse than getting eaten. I guess it would be worse if you were eaten before you had any offspring than after, but that's about it. So this is a definite positive-negative interaction. Another one that's sort of a subtler version of predation is parasitism. So one, the parasite, benefits, and one suffers. So the animal that's being fed on is damaged, but it doesn't necessarily die. And in fact, the damage can be really minor. This human is losing a tiny amount of blood, and they're getting an itchy bump, and they have a small immune reaction. Unless, of course, this mosquito is actually mediating yet another interaction and is carrying a malaria parasite. And then we would have to look at the net positive and negative of the interaction between the malaria and the human, and the malaria and the mosquito, and then the mosquito and the human. And it becomes much more negative for the human because the mosquito was a vector of this other much more damaging parasite. So parasitism, and then let's look at herbivory. And herbivory is probably the most widespread type of interaction on this planet because plants and photosynthesizers are the base of the food chain. They're capturing all of the energy input that is going through the biosphere, and they're being eaten all the time by lots of things. The largest group of animals are herbivores. So in herbivory, it's usually a bit more like parasitism than it is like predation because the plant is damaged. But in general, the herbivore isn't eating the entire plant in one go, or at least not, digging up the roots and eating those. But occasionally it is. So in those cases, it's almost predation. And in some cases, herbivory looks a lot like that mosquito interaction, almost like parasitism, where the herbivores are taking a tiny bite, say a sucking insect, but again, like with the malaria, they might be transmitting yet another interaction, say a disease that then infects the plant and has other cascading effects. So I've been trying to keep this one-to-one, right? Just a pair of interactions, but already I'm pulling in additional interactions. You see where this is going. So herbivores are the most important in terms of impact. And then there are funny types of herbivory. Since I'm an ant biologist, I have to throw in a few examples. This is a leafcutter ant, and she's a worker, and she's gone out with a bunch of her sisters and cut this nice chunk out of a leaf of a nearby plant. Her jaws are like scissors, and she's carrying it back to her nest, which is quite large, like it's bigger than a car underground. And these ants don't eat leaves. What they do, they have a mutualist partner, which is a positive interaction coming right up, that's a fungus that has co-evolved with these ants. And the ants tend this beautiful giant fungus garden underground. The balls of fungus can be about this big, and they can have many of them. And they are feeding that fungus the leaves constantly, and then the fungus is making these little fruit-like things on itself to feed the ants. And so these ants are only eating the fungus. They're taking care of the fungus is taking care of them. And when a new queen goes out to start a brand new colony, she flies out and she mates, and then she drops down and digs in. She's carrying a little piece of the mycelium in her mouth to start her own garden. So it's very tight partnership. But overall, so who's the herbivore here? Is it the ants or is it the fungus? Right? The real herbivore is the fungus garden, but the ants are like the waiters bringing the food. So that's kind of a cool one. Okay, so let's talk about commensalism for just a moment. Commensalism is the positive version of amensalism, where there's a net positive effect on one species, but kind of an unmeasurable or neutral effect on the other. I was trying to think of a good commensal interaction. I came up with this. Again, ants. So this is a kind of ant. This is a Trachymyrmex that lives in Arizona. And these also have a fungus garden and only eat the fungus. But they are more specialized. Their fungus doesn't want cut leaves. It wants pre-chewed leaves. And so these ants just go around under our native oak trees, and they search for freshly dropped caterpillar poops from the caterpillars that live up in the oak trees and feed on the oak leaves. And all they do is they pick up these fresh poops of chewed up leaves, pre-digested, and they just feed these poops to their fungus garden. All right, so what is the effect of the caterpillar on the ant? Very positive. What is the effect of the ant on the caterpillar? Negligible. They're up there, ants down there. But wait. Okay, so hear me out. This is actually a complicated interaction that's involving many partners, and we could expand it further than on this slide. There's an herbivory interaction that's positive, negative. The caterpillar is feeding on the tree. Then they drop their poop, and the ants collect the poop, and that's sort of positive for the ant, no effect on the caterpillar. But then the ants are giving the poop to their fungus garden, and that's giving food to the ants. So that's a definite positive, a very strong, tightly linked plus interaction. Now, the ants and the fungus are living in the soil under this tree. And the ants are some of the major things turning over the soil and aerating the soil and adding nutrients to the soil. And not only that, but that fungus garden is constantly making big piles of the most beautiful compost you have ever seen. And the ants actually sort of take that out and dump it. And it is fertilizing the tree and really making the soil quite nice. Around this nest, you'll see a lot of things growing, and it's right in the roots of the tree. So it's quite possibly positive for the tree. And then the plants in the area, and these ants are collecting from several different trees around their nest are competing with each other, both for those nutrients and to put energy. They also have a negative effect where they're putting energy into defenses against those caterpillars. So we could start to ask questions like, what is the net effect of the fungus garden on the tree? Or what's the effect of the fungus garden on the caterpillar? Right? We can make arrows in between. And then not only that, there are a whole bunch of other insects living on the tree. There's a bunch of other plants around the tree. So if we add them in, we'll start to measure all of these positive, negative, and somewhat neutral effects in this ever-growing web. Right? And you can get a lot of indirect effects. So do the ants indirectly benefit the caterpillar by improving soil for the tree? Quite possibly, actually. The caterpillars tend to be on the healthiest, most luscious looking of these trees, and that's also where the ants tend to be. Okay, so that brings us nicely to my favorite category, which is mutualism. And these are any interactions where the net benefit is positive for both partners. We used to think that mutualism was really rare in the environment, but it turns out that it's extremely common and one of the driving forces organizing systems on Earth. We're constantly finding new mutualisms of varying strength. So the most famous mutualism, of course, on Earth is pollination. Both partners here are benefiting. The plant is getting its pollen transferred to another plant, and it's getting cross-fertilized, so it has higher quality offspring. And the bumblebee here, I think that's a bumblebee queen, is getting food, both for her and for her offspring. She's getting pollen, which has a lot of protein in it, and she's getting nectar, which has sugar that is easy power for flying and doing things. One thing to point out here, though, even though mutualism is common, and mutualism is awesome, it's plus, very feel good. It is not altruism. The motives of both parties here are entirely selfish. If this bee could get more from this flower by killing it, she would. Same with the flower. If the flower could get itself pollinated even better, and sucks to be you, bees, flower would. Right? You can almost think of mutualisms as mutual parasitism. That's really a much more accurate way to look at this. Bees are not pollinating out of the goodness of their hearts. But yet, because both partners are constantly evolving, that tug of war keeps it in this space of net benefits to both, which is a nice space to be in, right? So, yeah, coming back to my ant and its fungus garden, this is a mutualism between the fungus, there it is, and the ants, right? The ants are doing food and care and propagation, and they're getting fed and taken care of. So now I'll show you a little bit of a funny mutualism. So here, these ants are tending some aphids. They treat them like livestock, and there are even some ants that will carry their herd of aphids to a new plant when they've kind of used up the current plant. They're like nomadic herders, and they protect their aphids very strongly. If something comes in like a parasitic wasp, the ants will... Sorry about that. Trying to get... Oop. Can you hear me now? Yeah. Oop. This doesn't stick very well. I was trying to get a drink of water since I'm getting a little bit of a hoarse. Getting a little bit hoarse, so. Okay, how about now? Can you hear me okay? All right, I'll sip this water and then tell you about these ants. Careful. Okay, so what are these ants getting? Well, they're sucking on the sap of the plant, and the sap is chock full of sugar and has very little nitrogen. And so the aphids, in order to get a balanced meal, poop out most of the sugar. They don't even use it. So that honeydew that they're dropping is just extra sugar that they don't want to bother digesting. What would they do with it? So they just take enough for their body, and then they get these very rare nutrients out of there. And the ants love the sugary stuff. They're getting their nitrogen from elsewhere in the environment, things like prey insects. So they are tending these aphids and taking care of them in order to get that sugary liquid. So they're basically drinking up the poop from the aphids, taking care of them, protecting them. And so you might think that the effect on the plant here must be negative, because these ants are putting aphids on the plant and then protecting the aphids from any damage. And the aphids are sucking on the plant and causing it damage. But when we've measured overall effects in many different plant aphid ant systems, we find that that's not always the case. Sometimes the net effect on the plant is negative, but sometimes having ants on the plant, even if they're being fed by aphids, is a net gain for the plants, because having ants on you is great from a plant perspective. They attack everything. And so they're a great deterrent for more damaging herbivores. So we've measured in many cases plants where ants are tending aphids are actually setting more seeds and doing better because they're receiving less damage from other things like caterpillars. But it's very context dependent, and it can switch from season to season. It might be a net benefit in the spring, but then when there's a drought, then it becomes a net negative, or it's situational, or varies year to year. But ants and aphids on a plant are not always a bad thing. And some plants have what are called extrafloral nectaries, and that's a little organ, and they can be all different places, where the plant is secreting sugary liquid to attract ants. So it's almost like the plant has evolved to have a pretend aphid on it just to bring in ants, and it's giving away this sap. And that's something I've studied in different systems. And I'll give you one example of this before we get into chemistry parts of these interactions. So this is a fun one that a friend and I discovered in Australia. So this is, I think, a black wattle tree, and that's the extrafloral nectary, that resource nectar. And these are trapjaw ants, which are really awesome Odonomachus ants with great big jaws that can snap like a mousetrap. And they really want that nectar on the plant. And they want to prevent all the other types of ants, like that red ant, from getting to the nectar. And so these ants, actually, we observed them using tools to mediate this exchange. They, in the morning, go down to the bottom of the plant, and with their big jaws, they pick up little stones, and they carry them up the plant, and then they put them on that extrafloral nectary and stack them, and they stick because there's sticky liquid coming out. And then these ants aren't really busy during the day. They hide underground. They don't like to get very hot. So they go away for the rest of the day. And this pile of stones sits there stuck to the extrafloral nectary. And we watched as all these other types of ants who don't have the big jaws came up and tried to drink. And none of them could get the sugar because it was soaking up into this little ball of rocks and drying out into this crusty thing, and they couldn't move it. And then in the evening, we observed over and over that the trapjaw ants came back out, climbed back up, grabbed their bowl of rocks, and carried the whole thing down into the nest. So here, this is competition between the ants for the ability to participate in the mutualism with the plant. And the ants here have come up with this tool use strategy to make their gathering of the reward more efficient. But it's actually a net negative for the plant, the fact that they're doing this, because the ants can go home and not do their job for the rest of the day. And so no one's there protecting the plant because they left. They're letting the rocks do the job. So that's a rather amusing one. Okay, so zooming out a little more, let's think about mutualisms and interaction webs with a lot of species now. These are 4 different locations where some scientists went out into the environment and they found every interaction that was mutualistic between ants and plants. So the ants, I think, are on the right of each of these webs, and the plants are on the left. You can see there's more types of plants than there are of ants. And they just drew a line between the ant and the plant if there was an interaction. So compare these different locations, these different sites. So La Mancha is very well connected. Many ants are going to many different plants. Whereas in Jalapa there, it's not very well connected. There's a few ants and a few plants, and many of them have only one line connecting them, which means that only one type of ant is going to that plant. So which of these ecosystems is more robust to damage? What if I came in here to each of these sites and I killed 30% of all the life? And they need those interactions. So which one is more likely to leave someone high and dry? Some plant or some ant has no partner at all. It's the one with fewer connections. The more connections there are in an ecosystem, and the more redundancy there is, and the more different directions those connections go, the more robust that ecosystem is to damage, even if something really bad happens. The really well-connected ecosystems, including the negative interactions, these are just the positive ones, but I could expand this to add more types of individuals, more types of species, and more types of interactions. I could add all the herbivory. I could just keep going until it's one unreadable mess of lines. The more well-connected an ecosystem is, the better an individual type of species tends to do, because there's this redundancy and this support, and there are these indirect effects. So even if something really bad comes in, like an herbivore that's going to eat all your leaves off, there are all these other things doing other things that are impacting both that herbivore and the plant, and it's much less likely to go to the extreme. So there might be some damage, but other things are going to mediate that, and it's less likely that the whole plant is just going to get killed, right? Whereas if that plant is all alone in a flower pot in the middle of a parking lot, and it has no friends, it's really vulnerable. It's out there, and if some pest comes in and starts feeding on it, it's more likely that nothing's going to mediate that interaction, and it will just get killed. So happy ecosystems are ecosystems where there are a lot of interactions. And we know this from many studies. And it gets much more complicated than I'm making it, but that's the basics. So are there neutral interactions? I actually don't really think so. I think that in an ecosystem, there are so many indirect effects that everything is influencing everything, at least in a small way. It just becomes increasingly difficult to measure those interactions as stuff gets more diffuse. So that brings me to plants and ways that they might mediate their interactions with pests. Because they're not passive participants. They're not just like sitting there waiting, what will happen to me? Will I be eaten? Right? They can do things to try and affect the outcome of all the interactions that they are having. And of course, plants do have behaviors. They can grow in different directions. They can communicate with each other via chemical signals, maybe intentionally, maybe not. And they can move in response to stimuli, either by growing, or some of them actually move in quickly enough for us to see it. But in terms of avoiding being eaten, what kinds of things can plants do to avoid being eaten? Well, one thing they do frequently is reward their mutualists for protection, especially ants. Plants love to bring in ants. They will also sometimes release a chemical signal that can be detected by things like parasitic wasps that will then come in and attack the caterpillar or whatever's chewing on them. They can make a large variety of structures to protect themselves. Things like sticky hairs or balloon-shaped seeds or traps. And then the big category. This is where plants really excel and really work to mediate interactions: chemistry. Plants make so many types of chemicals that it would be impossible to cover even the basic classes of chemistry, plant chemistry in one talk. But we call these secondary chemicals or chemical metabolites. These are chemicals that a plant does not need in order to run its own body and its own metabolism. Plants make tons of these extra chemicals, not for themselves, but in order to mediate these interactions with other things. And then plants can also do things chemically to make their tissues more unappealing, taste bad, or undigestible, or sticky, or they can also manipulate what nutrients are in their tissues so that it's incomplete as a diet for things, and things get malnutrition feeding on them. So let's talk about plant chemical defenses. We think that plant chemical defenses started right off the get-go with the earliest land plants, and of course there are chemical defenses for plants in the oceans as well. One thing that we know that plants did as early as the Devonian is when they moved onto land, plants stopped using iodine in their cells, whereas in the ocean iodine is available and it's used. And by shifting away, finding an alternate way to run their cells without iodine, they don't supply this valuable nutrient. That's why you buy iodized salt and it says supplies iodine, a necessary nutrient. Because animals never figured out this trick. So animals are on land and they're feeding on plants, but if they rely solely on those plants, they're going to be iodine deficient. So this clever trick has been used over and over by plants. They'll sort of move away from containing certain amino acids or certain vital nutrients. And that forces their herbivores to seek out a more varied diet. They have to find other sources, so they can't only rely on this one plant. Or they have to get a very bizarre metabolism in response. And then plants can also actively block iodine transport in insects. I think this is maybe one of the earlier innovations in plant poisons. Plants can make compounds that block iodine transport in animals, and of course that is very damaging or fatal. So plants make all these tricky chemicals, and we know a lot about the types that they have now. Of course, these things don't necessarily always fossilize, so we don't know what was developed when. But I'll just show you a few so you get a sense of the types of things plants are doing. So let's look at some glycosides. This is oleandrin, which is named after oleander, and that's a poison, right? Oleander is poisonous. You do not want to go out and eat oleander. And this is a glycoside, and it's a huge class of chemicals that all have this sugar here. And the thing that makes it a glycoside is the way that the sugar's attached. So this little oxygen bond here makes this a glycoside. It's no coincidence that it starts with glyco, right? It's sugar. And then there's something else tacked on there, and it's usually something poisonous. And these often interfere with cardiac behavior or nerve signaling in some way. And there are so many of them. So some of them are really toxic poisons, like oleandrin. Some of them are actually used by humans as medication. In the right dose, the poison can be a medicine. So like digoxin is another glycoside. And insects, over and over again, every time the plants come up with a new glycoside, because they're constantly evolving, and once the insects develop a way to deal with one poison, they modify it. And the plants will tack something else on to this molecule, and then the insects again are getting poisoned until they evolve a way to deal with that shape. But they're all variations on this theme. And then there's the cyanogenic glycosides. So this one, here's a glycoside that, see this triple bonded carbon nitrogen? That's a nasty thing. So oxygen would love to participate in this. So that is cyanide right there. And what happens is the plants will store these cyanogenic making cyanide glycosides in a vacuole in their tissues where it's just like contained and waiting. And then if they get bitten, it breaks the vacuole, and then very conveniently right there in the cytoplasm, in the cell, they have an enzyme that's ready to snip that cyanide right off that molecule and release it. So as soon as something bites into that cell, hydrogen cyanide is released. Very nice. So actually, pretty common. Okay, so let's look at another thing. So a lot of these chemicals sort of straddle the line between toxin and medicine for humans. Humans have figured out how to use a lot of these things in different doses. This is scopolamine, and it's one of many secondary chemicals in datura, which in the right doses is sort of psychoactive plant. It grows around here. Very, very beautiful plant. And scopolamine is a great anti-nausea thing that's used after surgery, often in a little patch, in the right dose. It could also be fatal in the wrong dose. Also, it's a word to the wise, do not touch this plant and then touch your eyes. My advisor in grad school actually went to the hospital thinking that they were having a stroke. And what happened, they were working with this plant and touched their eye, and this eye fully dilated for 3 days. This is an amazing plant. But insects have figured out how to deal with it, at least a few. So what happens is plants become more and more specialized chemically. The insects become more and more specialized to relying only on that plant because they have to get more and more special adaptations for dealing with all these things the plant keeps throwing at them. It's this arms race. So one example are the hawk moths that feed on and pollinate datura. And this is actually turned into kind of a tight mutualism. As a larval form, the caterpillars are the main herbivore on datura, and they'll eat this plant down to the ground very rapidly. But when they become an adult, they are the main pollinator of this plant. And the plant has actually adapted to become quite specialized on them as a pollinator and to have these really long tubular white flowers specifically for attracting these moths. And they have special odor cues that they've released that the moths have adapted to detect and fly to, including CO2. When these flowers open, they release this big pulse of CO2, and the moths can smell CO2 and they actually fly up the plume of it. So if you measure all the net negatives and benefits in this system, even though they're the main herbivore and they do all this damage, it seems to be a net positive for the plant. They're partners, just kind of antagonistic partners. Here's another cool one that's local. This is a neophyte. This is ephedra, or Mormon tea, if you've seen this plant. And it makes ephedrine, which is a precursor for methamphetamine. And there's methamphetamine and ephedra next to each other. You can see how similar they are, and unsurprisingly, with a chemical that has such strong effects on the nervous system, this is an insecticide, right? The plant did not evolve this to make drugs. It evolved this as a plant defense against herbivores. And so there's a whole class of chemicals based off this skeleton as well. But yeah, it's an insect repellent. Okay, how about this one? If you ever wondered why does cannabis make THC and CBD and all those other chemicals, it's not to get people high, right? The plant could care less. But look at the amount of effort this plant has gone into making these chemicals, right, on these little hairs. That's a lot of stuff that this plant is manufacturing. And of course, humans have selected to force them to make even more than they naturally did, right? We're very good at that. But cannabis makes THC and CBD because they're insecticides. CBD, this is a figure from a paper where they used high CBD and low CBD cultivars, and they put tomato hornworm caterpillars in there and let them choose what to eat. And then they also measured the weight and the number of caterpillars that died after eating this. And the CBD, first of all, they don't want to eat it. And if you force them to eat it, they mostly die or don't gain weight. So it's an insecticide. And that's why the plant is doing this. And of course, we humans are so good at co-opting this sort of chemistry and going nuts with it. But the plants invented this stuff. We didn't come up with this out of thin air. Here's another one we didn't come up with out of thin air. Pyrethrins, pyrethroids. This whole extremely diverse class of pesticides are all based off this backbone that comes from a chrysanthemum plant. And we've invented so many variations on this backbone. And every time you change it a little bit, the insects don't have the ability to deal with it until they evolve that ability. And then there's resistance to that pesticide, so we change it a little more. And then you've got like tetramethrin and on it goes. So we've just taken this arms race that the plants were already doing and accelerated it. Except we can do nasty things like tack a fluorine on there. And life on Earth has never seen that in 500 million years. There's no architecture to deal with that. That's a nasty trick. And so suddenly you've taken something that eventually gets broken down and made it into something that doesn't break down ever and just sits around and keeps killing things. So it's worth questioning, like, what are the sensible ways to alter these things? Okay, here's another one. Nicotine, right? Why make nicotine? It's an insecticide. We make a lot of neonicotinoids, and they're highly variable. Here's one, imidacloprid. That's a neonic. You can see how it's sort of similar to nicotine there. It's just got more stuff tacked onto it. And although animals can break down nicotine, they can't break down imidacloprid because they don't have an enzyme yet to break parts of it. And so it will break down partway and then become something rather toxic. So, chemical defenses produced by plants, they're incredibly diverse. You could spend your lifetime studying plant secondary chemistry and still discover new thing after new thing. But they make repellents, they make poisons, they make psychoactive drugs, they make digestive disruptors, they make reproductive disruptors, they make hormone mimics, they make signals to predators and protectors. They purposefully put in nutrient deficiencies, they make nervous system damaging things and heart damaging things. They're amazing. So what can we learn from this? Here's my take home and my approach. When you look at plants in the wild, or happy plants, this is actually a picture I took last week at the Arizona Sonoran Desert Museum in Tucson. Look at that tree. That is a happy tree there. That's a mesquite in amongst all its friends. That tree is happy because it has friends. It's well embedded in a healthy ecosystem that's being mediated in many ways. So the kind of opposite to this scenario would be something like when the boll weevil came in and we had these monocultures of cotton. And the cotton plants are all there. It's this huge resource. And the cotton is it's not being grown in its natural habitat with all of its partners. And then the boll weevil comes in and it's escaped from all its predators and partners and things that mediate it. You throw them two together in a big field, and you can get kind of a pest outbreak, massive disaster. Whereas in a situation like this, where a lot of things are together and you've got really healthy soil and mulch with a big community down in the soil, all those things are mediating interactions, and you're less likely to get these extremes. So, yeah, a lonely plant is a vulnerable plant. Give your plants friends. And plants, they use chemicals all the time, but they do it very judiciously, right? A lot of them will only make some pesticide when they really have a problem, and they'll only make a little bit of it. And they usually only make things that break down in a sensible amount of time, right? No plant wants to make a poison that sits there for the next 5 years because the situation is always changing. And it may be that they don't want it next week. And so life is really good at breaking down all these chemicals that plants make in a reasonable time frame. So, yeah, maybe think about this next time you're thinking about chemistry, and think about when you apply a chemical, what's your goal? And how do you want to just gently maneuver these interactions to something that favors you? You don't need to like kill everything in the web except for the one thing that you wanted, because then it's so vulnerable. So surround your trees with a supportive ecosystem. Consider the downstream effects past just the plant herbivore. And, you know, completely novel chemistry, things that have never been seen on Earth before, tend to be more damaging to humans. Things that contain elements that aren't usually in life, like bromine and fluorine, those are things that are going to sit around a long time because life doesn't know what to do with them. They don't break. They don't come apart. And they'll be poisoning people in 100 years. And then think about how long the chemical persists or where it will end up. Because you want your plants to have the most supportive environment, and that may include using chemistry, but you don't want to accidentally screw things up for yourself down the road. So that's kind of my take-homes on what humans can learn from plants about pesticides. So, thanks.
Okay, we
we
got
don't
time
have-
for a few questions.
We do,
Who's
okay,
got
cool.
some? Okay.
I don't really know how to phrase it, but you mentioned that plants can lose nutrients over time. Does that affect the vegetables that we eat since we've been cultivating them for so long?
Absolutely. There are actually some studies looking at the nutritional value of plants and heirloom crops versus, you know, really modified crops, and also the nutritive value of plants grown under different conditions. Like as soil degrades, the nutritious value of plants degrades. So they might still have the same number of calories, but you're losing those micronutrients that are super valuable. So it's definitely worth thinking about. And because different plants might not have certain nutrients, that's another reason to eat a varied diet.
Okay, more questions? Any online questions back? Oh, we got some over there, okay.
And you guys can ask me things at lunch. I'm by no means a pesticide expert, so I may or may not know, but we could look stuff up.
So I work in a greenhouse environment, and we don't spray any pesticides or anything like that. We don't use any fertilizers or anything. Are there studies being done, like you mentioned ephedra earlier? Are there studies being done maybe to use natural pesticides like that, like maybe boiling some ephedra to spray onto plants or something like that? Or if we just boil some THC, I don't know, you know.
This is a wonderful question, right? And people have done this, right? Neem oil is an example where you're using the plant product that people still extract pyrethrins from the chrysanthemum plant. People have used just blowing tobacco smoke onto plants is a great insecticide. And I think there should be a lot more work on finding those natural pesticides, like the ephedra idea. Why not try that? Go for it, right? What's the worst that can happen? You know, it's never going to be as well funded as like the pesticide industry, right? The motives there are not to find the best thing necessarily, but rather to find the thing that makes the most money. And boiling ephedra is not going to make the most money, but I think that we should look into that more, because what we really care about fundamentally is like healthy food crops, and that we still have in the next generation, right? To feed people. So I'm all for things like that, and I think it's worth experimenting. Plants have a lot going on chemical-wise. Just, if you do it with Datura, wear gloves. Okay. We still have time, or?
Yes, hi. I have an additional comment about that, is that we are not allowed to recommend. Yeah, so how would you comment on that, right? So we need to be following the label, and what do you recommend from that perspective?
Well, so I think that following the label is like key with pesticides, right? Because if you're not following the label, you're outside the bounds of how people have decided it's safe to use something. And you might very well be doing something dangerous. The thing is, I guess, for me, is that what's not on labels but is worth for your own knowledge figuring out is when you're picking what to use, you can look up more about its natural context. Like, what is this chemical? Where does it come from? What natural compounds in plants is it related to or not related to? But then when you go to use something, follow its label. And even so, neem, for instance, has a label, right? And so you still want to follow that. Whereas if you're experimenting, like with making up a new pesticide from a plant product, that would be more in the research category, right? You're no longer doing agriculture, you're doing research.
Thank you. And for NMDA, like pesticide applicators, license holders, the expectation and the commitment is to use products that have already been researched.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, I'm a researcher, so
Yeah.
that's more of a research question.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, questions from online. Given your work in the Chiricahuas, would you please talk about honeypot ants? We don't have much time, but which are found in the arid, lower elevation foothill regions of the mountains in southeastern Arizona.
Okay, well, this is something I research actively. And honeypot ants, they drink nectar from aphids or whatever, and they store it in their body. And they have specialized workers underground that take this honey and refine it. And instead of keeping it in a comb like bees would do, they keep it inside their bodies, and they swell up like little grapes underground. They specialized workers, and they hold that honey for years. And they're like the refrigerator. When the times are good, workers will come and they'll drink what they bring in. And then when times are bad, ants can come and ask, and they'll regurgitate the honey. And that actually has a natural preservative in it that the ants make. They're actually putting formic acid in that honey to keep it from fermenting and exploding themselves. So that's something we discovered recently.
Okay, and then another question that came from one of our streamers, and this is a question I have also because I did this last summer with we did this with several dozens of these hornworm caterpillars, is that the question is, if you were to move them from the tomato plant onto Datura, can they complete their life cycle?
I think they can. I think they might go through sort of an adjustment phase. Like it might, because they have grown up eating the tomato, they may not have switched up or ramped up all their genes for digesting these new toxins, but they can adjust. And so I think they will eventually adjust to the Datura. I don't think they'll die, but it's not instantaneous.
Thank you.
Cool. Well, thanks so much.
Yeah.
And before you go, so as a small token of Think Trees thank you to Dr. Lanan, we want to present you with one of the coveted Think Trees cookies to display as you will.
Oh, thank you.
Again,
Thanks a lot.
thank you.